German prisoners of war arrived in America believing women belonged in the home. Kinder, Küche, Kirche. Instead, they discovered 18 million American women building the bombers that were destroying their cities. Over 370,000 German POWs witnessed this industrial revolution firsthand, working alongside farm girls who could repair tractors and reading magazines featuring women welding battleships. I've analysed declassified POW camp records, war production statistics, and prisoner testimonies spanning 3 decades. You're about to discover how Nazi ideology collided with American reality, why female economic power terrified German soldiers more than combat, and how these prisoners returned home as unwitting witnesses to the power of social freedom. May 12, 1943, somewhere in the Atlantic, 300 miles from the American coast. Unteroffizier Klaus Richter pressed his face against the salt-crusted porthole of the Liberty ship, watching the grey waves roll past in endless procession. The hold stank of vomit, unwashed bodies, and fear. 200 German prisoners, survivors of Rommel's shattered Afrika Korps, lay in tiered bunks or sat hunched against bulkheads, silent in their defeat. Richter had been a soldier for 4 years. He'd marched through Poland, stood guard in occupied France, and fought across the scorching deserts of North Africa. He'd believed in the Reich, in the Führer's vision of German supremacy, in the inevitable triumph of discipline and will over the mongrel chaos of democracy. Now he was crossing an ocean as cargo, bound for imprisonment in the nation he'd been taught to despise. America, the decadent giant, the land of jazz music and gangsters, of racial mixing and moral decay, of soft men who couldn't produce a decent military rifle without copying German designs. He'd seen the propaganda films, heard the radio broadcasts, read the party newspapers. America was wealthy but weak, industrial but undisciplined, populated by people too comfortable and too diverse to sustain a real war effort. The United States had entered the war late, unprepared, with an army equipped with obsolete weapons and led by officers who'd never seen combat. German soldiers joked about American troops, called them Army with contempt, laughed at reports of their clumsy tactics and poor marksmanship. Richter believed this completely. He had to, because if America wasn't weak, if the propaganda was wrong, then Germany's defeat wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And that thought was unbearable. He was 26 years old, the son of a factory supervisor in Essen, raised in the Hitler Youth, trained to value order, hierarchy, discipline, and the proper place of things. Men fought, women bore children and maintained the home. This was natural law, not merely German law. The Führer had said it repeatedly. A woman's world was her family. Her duty was to produce strong sons for the Reich. Her place was the domestic sphere where her innate nurturing qualities could flourish. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Any nation that allowed women to abandon these sacred duties was fundamentally corrupt, denying biology and tradition alike. The Soviets forced women into factories and even combat roles, and look at them. Barbarous, godless, barely human. The British conscripted women for war work, and their empire was crumbling. America, Richter had been told, was worse. A culture so degraded that women smoked cigarettes in public, wore trousers, and demanded the same wages as men. Such a society couldn't sustain serious industrial production. It was too chaotic, too lacking in the discipline required for modern warfare. But something nagged at the edges of Richter's certainty. The ship carrying him to captivity was one of dozens he'd seen in convoy, all new, all moving with mechanical efficiency. The Liberty ship itself was crude, ugly, mass-produced, and there were hundreds of them. The American guards were casual, almost careless in their bearing, nothing like German military discipline. Yet they were well-fed, well-equipped, and utterly confident. They treated their prisoners not with the brutality Richter expected, but with a kind of indifferent efficiency, as if transporting captured soldiers was just another industrial task to be completed on schedule. One guard, a farm boy from Iowa, had told Richter in broken German that America was building a new Liberty ship every day. Every day. That couldn't be true. It was impossible. Germany's entire industrial capacity couldn't produce ships at such a rate. But if it was propaganda, why tell it to prisoners? What did they gain by lying to men who'd already been defeated? Richter pushed the thought away. He'd know the truth soon enough. The ship docked in New York Harbor on a grey morning in late May. Richter and his fellow prisoners were marched down the gangway in columns, guarded by American soldiers with rifles. What struck him first wasn't the guards, or the docks, or the processing stations. It was the skyline. Manhattan rose before them like something from a fever dream. Towers of steel and glass climbing toward low clouds. Buildings taller than anything in Berlin or Frankfurt. A forest of concrete and ambition that seemed to mock the very concept of limits. German cities were old, their centres medieval, their architecture human in scale. This was different. This was industrial might made visible, wealth transformed into vertical space, a city that declared through its physical presence that America operated on a scale Germany had never imagined. Richter felt something shift in his chest, something between awe and dread. He'd expected a primitive nation of cowboys and farmers. This was neither primitive nor familiar. This was something else entirely. They were loaded onto trains, old passenger cars converted for prisoner transport, windows covered with mesh but not blocked entirely. As the train moved west through New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Richter watched America pass outside his window. The landscapes were vast, the farms enormous, the roads wider than German autobahns and filled with cars. Not military vehicles, but civilian automobiles, thousands of them, moving freely in the middle of a war. Every town had paved streets, electric lights, and buildings that looked new, prosperous, untouched by rationing or scarcity. There were no bomb craters, no rubble, no empty storefronts or shuttered factories. Instead, he saw factory complexes that stretched for miles, smoke rising from countless chimneys, rail yards filled with freight cars, warehouses that could swallow entire German production facilities. This wasn't a nation mobilizing for war. This was a nation that had absorbed total war into its normal industrial rhythm without apparent strain. But what Richter didn't know, what none of the prisoners staring out those mesh-covered windows could have guessed, was that the industrial colossus crushing their homeland wasn't powered primarily by men. He assumed, as any German soldier would, that American factories were staffed by male workers, that the vast production he witnessed was the output of masculine labor directed by masculine discipline. He had no framework for imagining anything different. In Germany, women had been pulled into war work reluctantly, temporarily, always with the understanding that their presence in factories was an emergency measure to be reversed at war's end. The party made sure everyone knew this was abnormal, a necessary sacrifice that didn't change fundamental truths about natural gender roles. What the propaganda never told Richter, what he couldn't have believed if they had, was that the American war machine ran on female labor, that the bombers falling on German cities were built by women, that the ships carrying men and material across the Atlantic were welded by women, that the ammunition tearing through Wehrmacht formations was assembled by women, that the very train carrying him into captivity had been maintained and serviced by women. 18 million American women had entered the industrial workforce, transforming the United States into a production juggernaut that would outproduce the entire Axis combined, and Richter was about to meet them. The train rolled through the night. Richter dozed fitfully, waking to see darkness broken by distant factory lights, by small-town main streets glowing with electric signs, by a landscape that seemed inexhaustible in its space and wealth. He'd been told to expect prison camps that were brutal, guards who were cruel, treatment that violated every convention of warfare. He'd been told America was a nation of savages beneath a thin veneer of civilization that capture meant likely death or torture. But the evidence of his senses contradicted everything he'd been taught. The guards were casual, but not cruel. The food, though simple, was abundant. The prisoner processing had been efficient and bureaucratic rather than sadistic. Either the propaganda had been catastrophically wrong, or this was an elaborate deception designed to weaken prisoners' will to resist. Richter didn't know which possibility frightened him more. Because if the propaganda was wrong about this, what else was it wrong about? And if his certainty about American weakness was misplaced, then what did that mean for Germany's chances? What did it mean for the ideology he'd built his adult life around? The train stopped at dawn in the middle of Iowa. Richter and 50 other prisoners were unloaded at a rural station and loaded onto trucks. They drove for an hour through farmland that stunned him with its scale, fields that stretched to the horizon, farms that could have swallowed entire German villages, tractors, and combines that looked new and expensive. This was supposed to be a backward agricultural region, yet it possessed machinery that would have been luxury items in Germany. They arrived at Camp Algona just after breakfast on a June morning that smelled of cut grass and livestock. The camp was new, hastily built, a collection of tar paper barracks surrounded by wire fences and guard towers. It looked temporary, improvised, nothing like the permanent fortifications of German prison camps. The guards were outnumbered by prisoners 10-1, another sign of either American confidence or American carelessness. Richter and his fellow prisoners were assigned bunks, issued work clothes, and given a briefing by a German-speaking American officer who explained the rules with a tone that suggested he was reading from a manual rather than imposing his will. They would work on local farms, replacing American laborers who'd gone to war. They'd be paid in camp scrip, allowed to send letters home, permitted to receive Red Cross packages, and generally treated according to Geneva Convention standards, as long as they didn't cause trouble. One of Richter's bunkmates, a sergeant from Hamburg, who'd spent time in Poland, laughed bitterly at the presentation. This wasn't imprisonment, he muttered. This was vacation. Wait until they saw what real hardship looked like. Wait until the Americans showed their true nature. Richter wasn't sure anymore. Nothing about his captivity so far matched his expectations. But he had no reference point for what he was about to experience, because tomorrow he'd be assigned to a farm owned by the Mueller family. And there, he'd meet someone who would shatter every assumption he'd ever held about women, labor, and the sources of national power. He'd meet Katherine Mueller, aged 23, who could disassemble and repair a tractor engine in under 2 hours, and she'd be just the beginning. The Mueller farm sat 7 miles outside Algona, 240 acres of corn and soybeans that had been in the family since the 1880s. Klaus Richter arrived there on a humid Tuesday morning in mid-June, riding in the back of an army truck with 3 other German prisoners. An American sergeant accompanied them, rifle across his lap, but his demeanor suggested he was there more to prevent the prisoners from getting lost than to prevent escape. Where would they run? They were 1,000 miles from any ocean, surrounded by farmland that stretched in every direction without obvious landmarks. Escape meant wandering until you collapsed from exposure or starvation. The truck pulled up a gravel driveway flanked by white-painted fences. The farmhouse was large, 2 stories, with a wraparound, and porch and flower gardens that suggested prosperity and care. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a massive red barn, machine sheds, a silo, chicken coops, and what looked like workers' quarters. Everything was painted, maintained, prosperous in a way that German farms, stripped of young men and resources for 5 years of war, could no longer manage. John Mueller met them at the barn, a man in his 60s with sun-weathered skin and hands that looked like leather. He wore denim overalls and a straw hat, and he assessed the prisoners with the same evaluative gaze he might use on livestock at auction. He spoke to the sergeant in English, gestures making the conversation clear enough. Richter and another prisoner, a former farmhand named Werner, would work here. The others would be taken to neighboring farms. The sergeant left. Mueller turned to the two Germans and attempted German, his accent thick with American vowels but his vocabulary adequate. He'd grown up speaking it at home, he explained, though the war had made that fact somewhat awkward in town. His parents had emigrated from Bavaria in 1898. He understood they were soldiers, that they'd done their duty, that they were here to work, not to be punished. If they worked hard, they'd be treated fairly. If they caused trouble, they'd be sent back to the camp and replaced. Simple enough? Richter nodded. This wasn't what he'd expected, being spoken to as a worker rather than a prisoner, being addressed in his own language by a farmer with German ancestry who showed neither hatred nor excessive sympathy. Just pragmatism. Just the American approach to problems he was beginning to understand. Practical, transactional, efficient. Mueller explained the work. The farm was short-handed. His son, Robert, was in the Pacific with the army. His youngest boy, James, was 17 and working double duty, but couldn't manage everything alone. The neighbours were in the same situation. Every farm within 10 miles had sent sons or hired hands to war. Last summer, high school students and women from town had helped with harvest. This summer, they had German prisoners. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, Mueller said with something that might have been humour. They'd spend today learning the layout, the equipment, the routine. Tomorrow, real work began. He led them through the farm, pointing out fields and machinery, explaining crop rotations and irrigation systems with the patient detail of a man who'd spent his life teaching others his craft. Richter listened, asked occasional questions, and tried to process what he was seeing. The scale was staggering. This single-family farm was larger than most German agricultural collectives. The equipment was modern, well-maintained, expensive. The barn held 3 tractors, 3 when most German farms would be lucky to have one. Mueller mentioned casually that they'd just purchased a new combine harvester, as if buying industrial farming equipment in the middle of a war was a normal consumer decision. But what struck Richter most was what he didn't see. He didn't see a wife bustling in the kitchen while men did field work. He didn't see traditional gender divisions. Instead, he saw a woman, Mueller's daughter, he assumed, emerging from one of the machine sheds wearing coveralls and work boots, grease smeared on her forearms, carrying a wrench that looked heavy enough to serve as a weapon. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with dark hair tied back in a practical bun, and an expression that suggested complete confidence in whatever task she'd just completed. Mueller called to her in English. She approached, wiping her hands on a rag, and looked at Richter and Werner with undisguised curiosity. Mueller switched to German for the prisoner's benefit. This was Katherine, his eldest daughter. She managed the machinery maintenance and handled most of the tractor work since Robert had enlisted. She'd be supervising some of their tasks. If they had questions about equipment, they should ask her. Katherine nodded at them, said something in English that sounded like a greeting, and returned to the machine shed. Richter stood very still, trying to reconcile what he'd just witnessed with everything he'd been taught about proper social order. A woman, maintaining tractors, supervising male workers, covered in grease and apparently comfortable with it. This wasn't emergency measures or desperate improvisation. This was normal operations for the Mueller farm. Mueller seemed to notice Richter's expression. He said something in German about Katherine being better with engines than most men he'd hired, that she'd been fixing farm equipment since she was 16, that she could diagnose a mechanical problem by sound alone. He said it with obvious pride, the way a German father might boast about a son's military achievements or academic honours. But this was a daughter, doing men's work, and her father celebrated it. Richter felt the ground shift slightly beneath his feet, a sensation he'd been experiencing with disturbing frequency since arriving in America. This wasn't how the world was supposed to function. This violated natural order, and yet, here it was, functioning quite well apparently. Werner, the other prisoner, seemed less troubled. He'd been a farmhand before the war, conscripted in 1941, and he approached the situation with a labourer's pragmatism. Work was work. If Americans wanted women running tractors, that was their business. He was just grateful to be out of North Africa, away from the combat, doing something familiar. But Richter couldn't achieve that detachment. He was watching his ideological certainties crack in real time, and he didn't yet understand the full extent of what he was witnessing. Because Katherine Mueller wasn't an anomaly. She was a representative of the largest workforce transformation in American history. And Richter was about to discover that the industrial power-crushing Germany wasn't primarily masculine at all. Mueller led them to the workers' quarters, a small building with bunks, a wood stove, and basic furniture. They'd sleep here, take meals at the main house, work dawn to dusk 6 days a week. Sundays were rest, as per Geneva Convention requirements. They'd be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, which they could use at the camp canteen. It was less than American workers earned, but more than German soldiers received. Questions. Richter had 1,000 questions, but none he could articulate in his limited English or Mueller's rusty German. That first evening, they ate dinner at the Mueller family table, another violation of Richter's expectations. He'd assumed prisoners would eat separately, that there would be clear hierarchies maintained, that fraternization would be forbidden. Instead, they sat with the family, John Mueller, his wife Martha, Katherine, and young James. The food was abundant in a way that made Richter want to weep. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, bread with real butter, milk, and apple pie for dessert. This was a Wednesday dinner in June, not a holiday feast. This was normal abundance in wartime Iowa. In Germany, his mother would be stretching rations, substituting sawdust in bread, saving meat for special occasions. Here, the Muellers apologized for the simple meal, mentioned that they'd slaughtered the chicken that morning, wondered if the prisoners had enough to eat. The cognitive dissonance was becoming physical. Richter's stomach was full for the first time in months, yet he felt sick with realization. This family, representative of millions of American farming families, lived better during total war than German families had lived during peace. How was Germany supposed to defeat a nation with such casual abundance? After dinner, Katherine disappeared into what Martha called the office, a small room off the kitchen filled with papers, account books, and agricultural magazines. Richter glimpsed her through the open door, working with numbers, managing farm finances apparently, another task he'd never seen a German woman perform. Martha Mueller noticed his glance and said something in English to her husband, who translated. Katherine handled the bookkeeping now, had taken over when Robert left. She was good with figures, better than John was, and she managed their accounts with the grain elevator and the equipment dealers, also handled their war bond purchases. She'd bought $300 worth last month. Richter tried to understand. This woman repaired tractors, managed machinery, kept the financial books, and invested in war bonds. She performed the labour of 3 German men while maintaining a household role. And she was paid for it. Martha explained to us, through John's translation, that Katherine earned wages for her work, same as any hired man would, that the money was hers to save or spend. This was incomprehensible. In Germany, family labour was obligation, not employment. Daughters helped because it was duty, not because they received wages. The concept of paying your own daughter for farm work suggested a transactional relationship that violated everything Richter understood about family hierarchy and proper roles. But what Richter still didn't grasp was that Katherine Mueller represented just a tiny fraction of American female industrial mobilization. He thought he was witnessing a peculiar American farm family that violated traditional gender norms. He didn't yet understand that variations of Katherine Mueller existed in hundreds of thousands of factories, shipyards, and aircraft plants across America. He didn't know that while he'd been fighting in North Africa, women had been building the bombers that had driven him into defensive positions, that female hands had assembled the ammunition that had killed his comrades, that women had welded the Liberty ships carrying American troops and material into every theatre of war. He assumed American industrial power, however vast it appeared, was still fundamentally masculine in nature. He was catastrophically wrong. And over the next weeks, as he worked the Mueller farm and gained access to American media, he would discover just how wrong. That night, lying in his bunk in the workers' quarters, listening to Werner snore in the bed across the room, Richter tried to process the day. The abundance, the casual efficiency, the complete absence of the brutality he'd expected, and most disturbing of all, Katherine Mueller covered in grease, confident and competent, performing labour that no German woman of respectable family would ever attempt. He'd been taught that America was decadent precisely because it allowed women to abandon their natural roles. But what if that wasn't decadence? What if it was strength? What if unleashing the productive capacity of half the population, rather than confining them to domestic spaces, was the source of American industrial supremacy? The thought was terrifying because accepting it meant accepting that everything Germany believed about gender, society, and natural order was not just wrong, but actively counterproductive. It meant accepting that the Reich had crippled itself by maintaining traditional roles, while America had achieved overwhelming power by discarding them. Richter pushed the thought away. He'd been in America for less than 2 weeks. He'd seen one farm, one family, one woman who happened to be unusually capable with machinery. This didn't represent the whole nation. It couldn't. Because if it did, if Katherine Mueller was typical rather than exceptional, then Germany had never had a chance. The war was lost not on battlefields, but in the fundamental social organization of the opposing societies. Germany had mobilized its men and kept its women at home. America had mobilized everyone. And the mathematical consequences of that difference were now devastating German cities from the air and grinding German armies into dust on multiple fronts. But Richter wasn't ready to accept that yet. He'd need more evidence, more exposure, more undeniable proof, and America was about to provide it, because tomorrow Katherine would hand him a copy of Life magazine. And in its pages, he'd see the face of America's secret weapon repeated thousands of times. Women in factories, women building weapons, women powering the industrial colossus that Germany could never match. The revelation would break something fundamental in his worldview. But tonight, exhausted and overfed, he simply closed his eyes and tried not to think about what he'd already seen. The work began at dawn. Richter and Werner were assigned to field maintenance, checking irrigation lines, repairing fence posts damaged by spring storms, clearing drainage ditches clogged with debris. It was hard labour but familiar, the kind of agricultural work Richter had done as a boy on his uncle's farm outside Essen before the city swallowed the countryside. The June heat built steadily through the morning, heavy and humid in a way North African heat had never been. By mid-morning, his shirt was soaked through. Katherine drove past on a tractor, pulling a cultivator through the corn rows, and waved casually. She handled the machine with easy competence, making adjustments without slowing, reading the soil and crop conditions with the intuitive understanding that came from years of practice. Richter watched her work, trying to reconcile the image with his understanding of proper female behaviour. In Germany, women drove tractors only in dire emergency, and even then, it was seen as unfortunate necessity rather than normal labour allocation. Here, Katherine operated the equipment as if she owned it, which, Richter supposed, she partially did. At noon, they broke for lunch. Martha Mueller brought food to the field in a truck. Sandwiches thick with meat and cheese, fresh lemonade, cookies still warm from the oven. Katherine joined them, sitting on the truck's tailgate, eating quickly and efficiently like a working man. She asked Werner questions in halting German about farming methods in Europe, about crop yields and equipment. Werner answered readily, grateful for conversation in his own language. She listened with genuine interest, occasionally making notes in a small book she kept in her coverall pocket. When Werner mentioned that most German farms still relied heavily on horse-drawn equipment, that tractors were luxury items owned primarily by large estates or collectives, Katherine looked genuinely surprised. She asked how they managed harvests without mechanization, how they maintained productivity. Werner explained about longer hours, more hand labor, entire communities mobilizing for harvest, season. Katherine shook her head, said something in English that her father translated. That seemed inefficient, backward, unsustainable for modern agriculture. Richter felt a flash of defensive anger. Backward. Germany had been the industrial heart of Europe, the most technologically advanced nation on earth. But even as the anger rose, he couldn't deny what he'd seen on the Mueller farm. 3 tractors, modern combines, equipment that made German farming methods look, yes, backward by comparison. After lunch, Katherine returned to the machine shed. Richter, finishing his work on a fence line nearby, watched her through the open door. She had one of the tractors partially disassembled, working on what looked like a transmission problem. She moved with methodical precision, testing components, consulting a maintenance manual, making adjustments with tools that seemed almost extensions of her hands. At one point, she lifted an engine part that must have weighed 40 pounds, carried it to a workbench, and began cleaning it with solvent. Richter had seen German mechanics work with less confidence and skill. This wasn't a woman pretending to understand machinery or performing simple tasks while men handled complex repairs. This was an expert maintaining expensive equipment that her family's livelihood depended on. And she was doing it alone, without male supervision or assistance, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. When the workday ended, Richter returned to the workers' quarters exhausted and confused. His body ached from unfamiliar labor, but his mind ached more from trying to process what he was witnessing. Werner seemed untroubled, talking about the good food and easy conditions as if they'd won a lottery. But Richter couldn't achieve that simple acceptance. Everything he saw violated the natural order he'd been taught was immutable and divine. That evening after dinner, Katherine appeared at the workers' quarters door with a stack of magazines. She said something in English and gestured at them. Richter understood she was offering them reading material. Werner thanked her in German and took them eagerly. After she left, they examined the collection. Life magazine, several issues from spring 1943, the Saturday Evening Post, Collier's, American mass-market publications filled with photographs and advertisements that provided a window into civilian American life during war. Werner flipped through looking at pictures, making appreciative comments about American cars and consumer goods. But Richter opened Life magazine's April 19th issue and felt his world tilt on its axis. The cover showed a woman in work clothes, safety goggles pushed up on her forehead, holding a welding torch, with the headline, "Women in Steel." He turned to the featured article with hands that had begun to shake slightly. What he saw in the following pages was impossible. Or rather, it should have been impossible, but the photographs proved it was happening. Women welding ship hulls in massive shipyards that stretched to the horizon. Women assembling aircraft engines in factories the size of German cities. Women operating lathes and drill presses in machine shops. Women testing artillery shells. Women driving trucks, operating cranes, reading blueprints, supervising male workers. Page after page of photographs showed American women performing heavy industrial labor that German propaganda had always claimed was beyond female capability. The article explained that women now constituted over 30% of the aircraft industry workforce, that they were building bombers, fighters, and transports at a rate German intelligence couldn't credit. One photograph showed a woman named Rose Will Monroe riveting the fuselage of a B-24 Liberator bomber. The caption explained that she worked at the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where Ford Motor Company was producing bombers on an assembly line using automotive manufacturing techniques. The plant employed over 40,000 workers. More than half were women, they were building one B-24 every 63 minutes. Richter read that sentence 3 times. One 4-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes, from a single factory. The mathematical implications made his stomach clench. Germany's entire aircraft industry, using the finest engineers and most skilled craftsmen in Europe, couldn't match that production rate. And this was one factory among hundreds. The article continued with statistics that seemed designed to shatter any remaining German confidence. American women had taken over entire categories of war production. They comprised 80% of ammunition assembly workers. They built 60% of all small arms. They welded the Liberty ships that German U-boats couldn't sink fast enough to matter. The article quoted a War Production Board official. "Without women workers, we couldn't build the weapons to win this war. They're not supplementing male labor. They're the core of our industrial workforce." Richter turned the page and found a photograph that struck him like a physical blow. A young woman, probably no older than 20, standing in front of a massive industrial press that was stamping out shell casings. She was smiling directly at the camera, confident and proud, wearing work clothes and a headscarf. The caption identified her as a production line supervisor at an ammunition plant in Illinois. A supervisor. A woman barely out of adolescence, supervising a production line that was creating the artillery shells killing German soldiers on multiple fronts. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. Everything he'd been taught said this was wrong, unnatural, a violation of biological and social law. Women were nurturers, not builders. They created life in the domestic sphere, not death in industrial plants. Their hands were meant for children and homemaking, not welding torches and rivet guns. The Nazi ideology was explicit on this point. A woman who abandoned her natural role for masculine work was betraying her essential nature, degrading herself and society. The party had kept German women largely out of factories even as the war intensified, insisting that maintaining traditional gender roles was more important than marginal production increases. Germany had millions of women who could have been mobilized for industrial labor, but weren't, because doing so would violate the ideologues, foundations of the Reich. And here was America, casually deploying women across its entire industrial base, treating female industrial workers as normal rather than aberrant, and outproducing Germany by ratios that made victory mathematically impossible. But what struck Richter most wasn't just that women were working in factories. It was how they were portrayed. These weren't desperate women forced into labor by national emergency, photographed with sadness or resignation. These were confident, competent workers who looked proud of their contributions. The magazine showed them earning wages, opening bank accounts, buying war bonds with their income. It showed them gaining economic independence, learning skills, becoming what the article called a permanent part of the American workforce. The article quoted several women saying they had no intention of returning to purely domestic roles after the war, that they'd discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed, that industrial work had given them financial freedom and social respect. One woman, a former school teacher now building fighter plane engines, said, "I make more money now than my husband did before the war. I'm helping defeat fascism and securing my family's future. Why would I give that up?" This was the part that truly terrified Richter, because it suggested that American female mobilization wasn't temporary emergency measure. It was permanent social transformation. Germany had preserved traditional gender roles at the cost of production capacity, assuming the war would be won quickly and normal life would resume. America had unleashed economic and social forces that couldn't be reversed, had discovered that women could perform industrial labor as effectively as men, and would never accept returning half its population to purely domestic roles. Werner looked over Richter's shoulder at the magazine, whistled softly, and made a joke about American women being more dangerous than American soldiers. But Richter couldn't laugh. He turned the pages slowly, studying each photograph, reading each caption. trying to absorb the implications. A woman operating a massive industrial crane. A woman reading technical blueprints. A woman supervising a team of male workers. A woman testing aircraft engines. A woman inspecting artillery shells. A woman driving a freight truck. Page after page of evidence that America had mobilized its entire population, while Germany had mobilized only half. The industrial consequences were now devastating German cities and armies. He found another article about aircraft production. Boeing plants in Seattle building B-17 flying fortresses. Douglas plants in California building attack bombers and transports. Consolidated plants building B-24 Liberators. The numbers were staggering. Over 90,000 aircraft produced in 1942 alone, with 1943 production projected to exceed 120,000. Germany's entire aircraft industry had produced perhaps 15,000 planes in 1942. American women working in these plants outnumbered Germany's entire aircraft workforce, male and female combined. The Saturday Evening Post had a cover illustration by Norman Rockwell showing Rosie the Riveter, a muscular woman in work clothes, riveting gun resting on her lap, work boot crushing a copy of Mein Kampf. The symbolism was obvious and devastating. American women were literally crushing Nazi ideology through their industrial labor. The article inside profiled several women workers, describing their daily routines, their wages, their pride in their work. One woman, a welder at a shipyard in Portland, explained that she earned 75 cents per hour, more than double what most German women working in war plants earned, more than German soldiers received. She worked 50 hours per week, took home $37 after taxes, and was saving money to buy a house after the war. She had economic agency, future plans, independent income. She wasn't dependent on a husband or father for survival. She was, in the most fundamental sense, free in ways German women weren't, and that freedom translated directly into productive capacity that was winning the war. Richter closed the magazines and sat in silence. Werner had fallen asleep on his bunk, snoring softly. Outside, the Iowa summer evening was cooling, crickets beginning their night chorus. It should have been peaceful. But Richter's mind was in chaos. He thought about Katherine Mueller, who he'd dismissed mentally as an unusual case, an aberration in an otherwise traditional society. But she wasn't unusual at all. She was representative of millions. The women in the magazines weren't exceptional, they were typical. America had transformed its entire social structure to mobilize for war, had discovered that gender roles were social constructs rather than biological inevitabilities, and had gained overwhelming industrial superiority as a result. Germany had preserved tradition and lost the productive capacity of half its population. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. If America had 18 million women in the workforce producing war material, and Germany had perhaps 2 million in far more limited roles, the production differential wasn't just significant, it was decisive. German industry, already smaller and less mechanized than American industry, was operating at perhaps 40% of its potential capacity by excluding women from most industrial roles. America was operating at close to full capacity. The result was the ocean of war material now flowing across the Atlantic and Pacific, the endless waves of bombers over German cities, the artillery shells and ammunition that never ran short, the ships that replaced losses faster than U-boats could sink them. But accepting this meant accepting that Nazi ideology was fundamentally wrong, that preserving traditional gender roles wasn't a source of strength, but a catastrophic strategic error, that the party's insistence on keeping women at home had crippled Germany's ability to wage modern industrial war. It meant accepting that America's social decadence, its willingness to let women work for wages, its acceptance of female independence, its transformation of traditional family structures, was actually a source of immense power. It meant accepting that freedom, however chaotic and undisciplined it appeared, produced better results than order and hierarchy. These thoughts were dangerous, possibly treasonous, certainly incompatible with everything Richter had believed. Yet the evidence was undeniable. He'd seen it on the Mueller farm. He'd seen it in the magazines. He'd seen it in the ships that brought him to America, the trains that transported him across the continent, the trucks that delivered him to Iowa, the abundance of food and material goods in every town and farm. American power wasn't despite its social freedoms. It was because of them. Richter stood and walked outside, needing air. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the absence of city lights. He could see the lights of Algona in the distance, a small Midwestern town glowing with electric prosperity. Somewhere beyond that, in hundreds of cities across America, millions of women were working night shifts in factories, building weapons, earning wages, living lives that German women couldn't imagine. And tomorrow, they'd build more bombers, more ships, more tanks and artillery and ammunition. And Germany, clinging to its ideology, preserving its traditions, keeping its women at home, couldn't match that production. Could never match it. The war was lost. Perhaps it had always been lost. From the moment Germany defined strength as masculine and confined half its population to domestic roles, while America mobilized everyone regardless of gender. The next morning, Katherine was at the machine shed before dawn, and Richter found himself drawn there, despite having other assigned tasks. He watched her work on the tractor transmission, watched her solve mechanical problems with quiet competence, watched her embody everything Nazi ideology said was impossible. Finally, he approached an attempted conversation in his broken English supplemented by German. He pointed at the magazine from last night, asked if she was like the women in the pictures, if she considered herself a war worker. Katherine looked at him for a long moment, wiped her hands on a rag, and called her father over to translate properly. Through John Mueller, she explained that yes, she was a war worker, that her brother was fighting in the Pacific while she kept the farm running, that her labour freed men for combat and contributed to war production through agriculture. But she was also a war worker in another sense. Last winter, she'd spent 2 months working at a bomber plant in Omaha, installing electrical systems in B-29 Superfortresses. She'd earned good wages, learned valuable skills, and returned to the farm when planting season required her presence. She'd go back to the factory this winter if they needed her. She switched between agricultural and industrial labour as needed, contributing wherever she was most valuable. This flexibility, this willingness to deploy workers, male or female, wherever they produce the most value, was another American advantage Germany couldn't match. Richter asked, through Mueller's translation, if she understood that the bombers she'd helped build were destroying German cities. Katherine didn't flinch from the question. She said yes. She understood, that she'd thought about it carefully, that she believed the war was necessary to stop fascism and tyranny, that building bombers to end the war faster was more humanitarian than allowing it to drag on. She asked, gently but directly, if Richter understood what his army had done in Poland, in Russia, in the camps that American newspapers were beginning to report. Did he understand what he'd been fighting for? The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd been a soldier, following orders, believing in Germany's rightness and destiny. But what if Germany wasn't right? What if the propaganda that had portrayed America as weak and decadent was wrong? What did that suggest about all the other propaganda? What about the stories of German superiority, of Lebensraum necessity, of the Jewish threat, of the glorious future the Reich would build? If the foundations were lies, the entire structure collapsed. Katherine returned to her work, giving him space to process. Richter stood in the machine shed surrounded by American agricultural technology, maintained by a woman who'd built bombers in the winter, and felt the last pillars of his certainty crumble. Germany couldn't win this war. Perhaps it had never had a chance. And the reason was standing before him covered in engine grease, confident and competent, representing 18 million women who transformed American industrial capacity from impressive to overwhelming. The secret weapon wasn't a bomb or a plane or a ship. It was social freedom translated into productive power. It was the willingness to let women work, earn, learn, and contribute beyond traditional domestic roles. Germany had preserved tradition. America had unleashed potential. And the difference was measured in the rubble of German cities and the broken formations of German armies on every front. The weeks passed in a rhythm of farm labor and accumulating evidence. Richter worked the fields, repaired equipment, helped with irrigation, and watched American abundance unfold around him in ways that made denial impossible. Every Saturday, trucks arrived from town with supplies: fuel, machine parts, groceries, newspapers, and more magazines. The Mueller family subscribed to multiple publications, and Katherine, perhaps sensing Richter's hunger for information, continued providing him reading material. Each magazine brought new revelations. Collier's ran a feature on women shipbuilders in California, welding Liberty ships and Victory ships at a pace that German intelligence still refused to believe. The Saturday Evening Post profiled female aircraft mechanics who maintained Army Air Force bombers at bases across the country. Newsweek detailed women's contributions to ammunition production, explaining how standardization and assembly line techniques, developed for automotive manufacturing, had been adapted to produce artillery shells, small arms ammunition, and explosives at volumes that exceeded Axis production by factors of 5 or 10. The numbers haunted Richter. In 1943, American factories would produce over 40 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. 40 billion. Germany would produce perhaps 8 billion. American women assembled most of those rounds, their hands working in shifts around the clock, feeding an industrial system that never stopped, never slowed, never showed the strain that German production was beginning to exhibit. But it wasn't just the magazines that educated Richter. It was daily life on the Mueller farm and in the surrounding community. On Sundays, their day of rest, prisoners were sometimes allowed supervised trips into Algona. The town had a population of about 5,000, small by American standards, insignificant compared to German cities. Yet it possessed wealth and infrastructure that seemed disproportionate to its size. Paved streets, electric lights on every corner, a movie theatre showing current films, multiple grocery stores with shelves full of goods despite rationing, car dealerships with new vehicles, banks advertising loans and investment opportunities, and women everywhere, working in stores, driving trucks, operating business, moving through public spaces with confidence and independence that German women of similar social status would never display. Richter watched them and saw the magazine photographs made real and multiplied. A woman managing a hardware store, discussing tools and equipment with male customers who treated her expertise as normal. A woman driving a delivery truck for the grain elevator, handling commercial transport that in Germany would be exclusively male work. A woman working at the bank, not as a secretary, but as a loan officer, making financial decisions about farm mortgages and business credit. Young women, teenagers barely older than children, working at the drugstore soda fountain, earning wages, spending money on movies and magazines and cosmetics with a casual consumerism that suggested they viewed their earnings as their own, rather than family resources to be surrendered to male relatives. One Sunday in late July, Richter witnessed something that crystallized his understanding of the gulf between American and German society. A young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, pulled up to the general store in a nearly new Ford coupe, a personal automobile, not a family vehicle. She was alone, unescorted by male relatives, dressed in slacks and a blouse that would have been scandalous in Germany. She entered the store, purchased groceries, loaded them herself, and drove away. The entire transaction was completely ordinary to everyone present, but to Richter, it was a revelation of female autonomy that German society simply didn't permit. This woman had independent transportation, independent income, independent decision-making authority over her own time and resources. She wasn't waiting for male permission or escort. She was the full economic actor in American society, and her autonomy wasn't remarkable. It was expected. Multiply that independence by 18 million, and you began to understand American productive capacity. Women who controlled their own economic lives had every incentive to work hard, to earn more, to contribute to the war effort that would preserve their freedoms. German women, confined to domestic roles and economically dependent on men, had no such incentives even when they were grudgingly allowed into factories. The difference wasn't just in numbers employed, it was in the motivation and efficiency of their labour. Back at the farm, Richter began asking Katherine questions through her father's translation. Why did she work in the factory during winter? Why not stay home? Katherine's answer was simple. The money was excellent, the work was interesting, and she wanted to contribute to defeating fascism. She'd saved over $3,000 from her factory wages and farm work, enough to buy land, start a business, or pursue education after the war. She had options, possibilities, a future she was building through her own labour rather than through marriage or male relatives. This concept of female self-determination was alien to Richter's worldview, yet he couldn't deny its practical benefits. Katherine worked harder and more efficiently than many men Richter had known, because she had personal stake in the outcome. She wasn't labouring under compulsion or duty, she was building her own future. That motivation translated into productivity that conscripted labour or ideologically coerced labour could never match. He asked if other women felt the same way. Katherine laughed and gestured at the magazines. Of course they did. Millions of American women had discovered during the war that they were capable of work they'd been told was impossible for them. They'd learned skilled trades, earned substantial wages, gained confidence and economic independence. Many had no intention of surrendering those gains when the war ended. The social transformation was permanent, irreversible, and it gave America an economic advantage that would extend far beyond the current conflict. One evening in August, John Mueller brought home a new issue of Life magazine that featured a photo essay on the Willow Run bomber plant, the massive Ford facility in Michigan that Katherine had mentioned months before. The photographs were staggering in their implications. The factory was over 3 million square feet under one roof, making it one of the largest buildings in the world. The assembly line stretched for over a mile. At peak production, the plant employed 42,000 workers producing B-24 Liberators using automotive assembly techniques. The magazine showed women everywhere in the production process, installing electrical systems, riveting aluminum skin, testing hydraulics, inspecting finished components, even managing production teams. One photograph showed a woman foreman supervising a shift of 200 workers, male and female, who were assembling the forward fuselage section of a bomber. The caption explained that she'd been a schoolteacher before the war, had trained at the plant for 3 months, and now oversaw production that contributed to 8 bombers per day, 8 B-24s per day from one factory. Each bomber required over 1 million parts, involved hundreds of thousands of rivets, and represented countless hours of precision labour. And women performed most of that labour, their hands building the weapons that were systematically destroying Germany's ability to wage war. Richter did the mathematics in his head. 8 bombers per day meant over 2,400 per year from Willow Run alone. Germany's entire bomber production in 1943 would be perhaps 4,000 aircraft total. One American factory, employing primarily women, would produce over half of Germany's entire bomber output. And Willow Run was just one of dozens of major aircraft plants. Boeing, Douglas, Consolidated, North American, Martin, Lockheed, each employed tens of thousands of workers building bombers, fighters, and transports. The total American aircraft production for 1943 would exceed 85,000 planes. Germany would build perhaps 25,000. The ratio was catastrophic, and women's labor was the difference. Without female workers, American production would drop by half or more. With them, America outproduced the entire Axis combined. The strategic implications were inescapable. Germany could train better pilots, develop superior tactics, build qualitatively better aircraft. None of it mattered when facing quantitative superiority of 3 or 4 to 1. Eventually, the sheer weight of numbers would grind German forces down through attrition. Every German aircraft shot down represented irreplaceable industrial capacity and scarce resources. Every American aircraft shot down was replaced within days, sometimes hours, by the industrial system that never stopped producing. But beyond the military implications, Richter was beginning to understand the social and ideological dimensions of his discovery. Nazi ideology wasn't just wrong about women's capabilities, it was catastrophically wrong in ways that had cost Germany the war before fighting even began. The party had built its entire social program around rigid gender roles derived from romantic notions of traditional European society. Women were mothers and homemakers whose biological destiny was to produce children and maintain domestic spaces. Men were warriors and workers whose natural role was to compete, fight, and produce in the public sphere. This division was presented as natural law, as biological truth, as the foundation of healthy civilization. But America had proven it was nothing of the kind. Under roles were social constructs that could be reconfigured based on practical needs. Women could perform industrial labor as efficiently as men when given training and opportunity. They could operate complex machinery, learn technical skills, supervise production teams, and contribute to industrial output at levels equal to male workers. The only thing preventing this was social convention, not biological limitation. Germany had clung to social convention and crippled itself. America had abandoned convention and gained overwhelming power. Werner, his fellow prisoner, noticed Richter's obsession with the magazines and the questions about women workers. One night, he asked why it mattered so much. They were prisoners. The war would end with or without their understanding of American production methods. Why torture himself with evidence of German defeat? Richter tried to explain, but struggled to articulate the depth of his crisis. It wasn't just about losing the war. It was about discovering that everything he'd believed about society, gender, strength, and national power was wrong. He'd spent his adult life believing Nazi ideology represented truth, that the party understood natural law and social organization better than decadent democracies. But the evidence contradicted everything. If the party was wrong about women's capabilities, what else was it wrong about? What about racial ideology? What about Lebensraum? What about the necessity of authoritarian control? What about the Jewish threat? What about all of it? Werner had no answers. He'd been a farmhand before the war, conscripted and sent to North Africa, captured and shipped to Iowa. He'd never been ideological, never believed deeply in Nazi doctrine. For him, the war was just something that happened, and now it was over, at least his part in it. But Richter had believed. And watching his beliefs disintegrate under the weight of evidence was more painful than physical wounds. In late August, the camp commandant organized an educational program for prisoners, part of the denazification effort that the American government was beginning to implement. Prisoners were shown documentary films about American industry, about democratic government, about the prison camp system, and Geneva Convention protections. One film detailed war production, showing factories across America, the scale of mobilization, the techniques that enabled such vast output. And everywhere in the footage, women. Women workers were presented not as emergency measures, but as permanent features of American industrial capacity, as contributors whose skills and labor were essential to national power. The film included an interview with a War Production Board official who explained that without women workers, American war production would be impossible, that female labor wasn't supplementary, but foundational. The prisoners watched in silence. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others, like Richter, recognized it as truth they'd been refusing to accept. After the film, an American officer asked if there were questions. Richter, hesitant but compelled, asked in broken English how Germany was supposed to compete with American production, given the vast difference in industrial capacity. The officer's answer was blunt. Germany couldn't compete. The war's outcome had been determined by industrial mathematics, not battlefield tactics. Germany had fought skillfully and bravely, but courage couldn't overcome production ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. The Axis had lost the war the moment America entered it, because American industrial capacity, powered by total mobilization including women, exceeded Axis capacity by margins that made defeat inevitable. Back at the Mueller farm, Richter began to see Katherine differently. She wasn't an oddity or an exception. She was the future, a woman who worked for wages, controlled her own economic destiny, possessed skills traditionally coded as masculine, and moved through the world with confidence that came from competence and independence. Germany, if it survived the war, would eventually have to recognize that women like Katherine represented capability the nation couldn't afford to waste. The party's ideology would have to give way to practical necessity. Women would enter the workforce in larger numbers, would gain economic independence, would demand social and political rights commensurate with their contributions. The transformation America had undergone during the war would eventually come to Germany, whether the old guard liked it or not, because the lesson was undeniable. Nations that mobilized their entire populations, that granted women economic freedom and social respect, would outcompete nations that didn't. The future belonged to societies that recognized talent regardless of gender, that offered opportunities based on capability rather than biological sex, that understood productivity came from freedom rather than hierarchy. In September, Katherine began preparing for her return to the Omaha bomber plant for the winter season. She would leave after harvest, work until spring planting, and return to the farm. This cycle, agricultural labor in growing seasons, industrial labor in winter, was common among rural women who'd discovered factory work during the war. They moved between roles with fluidity that German society didn't permit, contributing where they were most needed, earning wages year-round, building financial security through diversified labor. Richter helped her tune up the tractors and combines for harvest, working under her supervision, taking instruction from a woman half his age, and feeling only gratitude for the knowledge she shared. His patriarchal conditioning hadn't disappeared, but it was crumbling under the weight of evidence and experience. Katherine was simply better at mechanical work than he was. Gender had nothing to do with capability. Everything he'd been taught was wrong, and that wrongness had cost Germany the war, cost millions of lives, cost his own future, and the futures of everyone he'd ever known. The revelation was devastating and complete. America's secret weapon wasn't technology or tactics or natural resources. It was social freedom. It was the willingness to let people, women especially, contribute according to their capabilities rather than their biology. And Germany, clinging to tradition and ideology, had never had a chance against that power. The war ended in May 1945. Klaus Richter remained at Camp Algona for 6 more months, while the American government processed repatriation paperwork and arranged transportation for hundreds of thousands of prisoners scattered across the United States. During those months, the full scope of Germany's defeat became undeniable. The newsreels showed the ruins of German cities, the skeletal remains of the industrial base that had once been the pride of Europe. They showed the concentration camps, the evidence of atrocities that made Richter physically ill and forced him to confront what his nation had done in the name of ideology. They showed the occupation zones, the complete military collapse, the utter devastation of a nation that had believed itself destined for greatness. Richter watched it all with the numb recognition that he'd known this outcome was inevitable since that night in June 1943. when he'd first opened Life magazine and seen the face of American industrial power. The only surprise was that Germany had held out as long as it did. In November, Richter boarded a Liberty ship in New York Harbor for the return journey to Europe. The ship was loaded with other prisoners, all heading home to a Germany that no longer existed as they'd known it. During the crossing, Richter stood on deck and thought about the journey 2.5 years earlier, when he'd crossed this same ocean, believing America was weak, decadent, incapable of sustained war effort. He'd been so certain of German superiority, so confident in Nazi ideology, so convinced that traditional values and racial purity would triumph over American chaos and diversity. Every single certainty had been shattered. He'd discovered that America's apparent chaos was actually flexibility, that its diversity was strength rather than weakness, that its social freedoms produced power that rigid hierarchies could never match. And most devastating of all, he'd learned that the ideology he'd built his adult life around was not just wrong, but catastrophically counterproductive, that Nazi beliefs about gender, race, and social organization had crippled Germany's ability to wage modern industrial war. The ship that carried him home, one of thousands of Liberty ships that had been the backbone of Allied logistics, had been built in 45 days by workers who included substantial numbers of women. 45 days from keel laying to launch. German shipyards, using traditional methods and all-male workforces, required 6 months to build equivalent vessels and produced a fraction of the volume. The ship itself was evidence of everything Richter had learned. American production speed came from standardization, assembly line techniques borrowed from automotive manufacturing, and total labor mobilization that included women in every role from welding to supervision. Germany had possessed the engineering knowledge to implement similar methods, but had refused on ideological grounds. The party insisted that quality craftsmanship required traditional methods, that standardization was somehow inferior to individual construction, that women couldn't perform heavy industrial labor. All lies, all catastrophically expensive lies. The convoy of Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic represented industrial philosophy that valued results over tradition, pragmatism over ideology, productivity over rigid social hierarchies, and that philosophy had won the war. Richter arrived in Bremerhaven in December 1945 to find a nation that barely resembled the one he'd left. The cities were rubble. The infrastructure was destroyed. The population was starving, desperate, traumatized by defeat and the revelations of what had been done in their name. The occupation forces, American, British, French, and Soviet, controlled everything. The Nazi Party was banned, its leaders dead or imprisoned, its ideology officially repudiated. But the transformation went deeper than political structures. German women, their husbands and sons dead or missing, their homes destroyed, their savings worthless, were working in whatever capacity they could find. They cleared rubble from the streets. They worked in occupation force facilities. They managed black market transactions. They did whatever was necessary to feed their families and survive. The rigid gender roles that Nazi ideology had mandated were irrelevant in the face of survival necessity. Women were doing men's work because there were no men, or because the men who remained were broken, traumatized, incapable of the labor required for reconstruction. The future that Richter had glimpsed on the Mueller farm, women working for wages, possessing economic agency, moving through public spaces with independence, was coming to Germany whether the old guard accepted it or not. He made his way back to Essen, or what remained of it. His family's neighborhood was rubble. The apartment building where he'd grown up was a burned shell. He found his mother living in a refugee shelter, his father dead in the final months of the war, his sister working for the British occupation forces as a translator. His mother looked 20 years older than when he'd last seen her in 1942. She told him about the bombing raids, the firestorms, the starvation rations, the collapse of everything they'd known. She told him about watching the city burn while party officials fled. She told him about the final months when everyone knew the war was lost. But the fighting continued anyway, consuming lives for no purpose. She asked him about America, about the prison camps, about what he'd seen. Richter tried to explain but couldn't find words adequate to the task. How could he make her understand that he'd witnessed the future? That American women building bombers had shown him what Germany would have to become if it wanted to survive? How could he explain that everything they'd believed about strength and tradition had been wrong? That their ideology had destroyed them more completely than Allied bombs? His sister understood more quickly. She'd worked with American occupation forces for 6 months, had seen their casual efficiency, their abundance, their utter confidence in their system. She'd watched American women soldiers, WACS, performing administrative and logistical roles with competence that challenged everything she'd been taught about female capabilities. She'd learned that American women had served in every theatre of the war in non-combat roles, that they'd been essential to military logistics, communications, and administration. The Americans treated female soldiers as normal, valuable, essential to operations. German military culture had never conceived of such a thing. Women as soldiers, as mechanics, as communication specialists, as administrators with actual authority. Impossible. Except it wasn't impossible. It was just different from German tradition. And that difference had contributed to Allied victory. Richter's sister said she was studying English, planning to attend university when German institutions reopened, determined to build a career independent of marriage or male relatives. She'd seen what was possible for women in Allied nations, and she wanted that possibility for herself. She represented the future that Nazi ideology had tried to prevent, but couldn't stop. The war had broken the old social structures permanently. Over the following months, as Richter worked whatever jobs he could find in the ruins of Essen, he watched Germany begin its transformation. The occupation forces implemented denazification programs, yes, but more importantly, they modeled different social organizations. American occupation zones in particular showed Germans what prosperity and freedom looked like in practice. The Marshall Plan began rebuilding Western European infrastructure, and American advisors brought American methods: standardization, assembly line production, total labor mobilization, including women. German women, having proven during the war's final years that they could perform industrial and administrative labor, refused to return exclusively to domestic roles. They demanded access to education, to professional work, to economic independence. The old men who'd run the Reich were gone, dead or discredited, their ideology revealed as the catastrophic failure it was. The new Germany would have to be different, and that difference would include recognizing women's capabilities and contributions. The lesson America had taught, that social freedom produced economic strength, was slowly, painfully being learned. Richter never forgot Katherine Mueller. He wondered sometimes if she'd returned to the bomber plant that winter, if she'd continued moving between farm and factory, building her savings and her future. He wondered if she understood how profoundly she'd affected him, how watching her repair tractors and reading about women like her building weapons had destroyed his ideology and shown him the truth about power in the modern world. She'd been kind to him, had given him magazines and answered his questions without judgment, had treated him as a person rather than an enemy. She'd represented everything Nazi propaganda said was wrong with America: female independence, economic freedom, social mobility, the breakdown of traditional hierarchies. And everything the propaganda said was wrong had actually been sources of immense strength. America had won the war not despite its social freedoms, but because of them. The nation that gave women opportunities, that valued capability over biology, that offered economic rewards for productivity regardless of gender. That nation had outproduced and overwhelmed the nation that clung to tradition and ideology. Years later, in the 1950s, as West Germany experienced its economic miracle and rebuilt itself as a modern democratic state, Richter would see echoes of what he'd witnessed in Iowa. German women working in offices and factories, German women attending universities, German women operating businesses, German women demanding equal pay for equal work. The transformation wasn't complete, traditional attitudes persisted, and Germany would struggle with gender equality for decades, but the direction was clear. The old ideology was dead. The future belonged to nations that mobilized their entire populations, that recognized talent wherever it emerged, that understood productivity came from freedom rather than hierarchy. Germany was learning this lesson reluctantly, painfully, forced to accept it by defeat and reconstruction. But it was learning, and in that learning was hope for a different kind of nation, one that valued all its citizens' contributions regardless of gender, one that chose pragmatism over ideology, one that might actually live up to the democratic principles it was being rebuilt upon. Klaus Richter never became a committed Democrat or feminist in the modern sense. The conditioning of his youth ran too deep, the habits of thought too ingrained, but he understood, in ways most Germans of his generation couldn't, that the old ways had failed catastrophically. He understood that America's secret weapon hadn't been the atomic bomb or the B-29 Superfortress or the Essex-class aircraft carrier. It had been the 18 million women who'd built the ships and planes and weapons, who'd powered the industrial colossus that no Axis nation could match, who'd proven through their labor that gender roles were social constructs rather than biological destiny. He understood that Germany had lost the war the moment it committed to ideology over pragmatism, tradition over capability, rigid social hierarchies over flexible mobilization. And he understood that any nation wanting to compete in the modern world would have to learn the lesson America had taught. That a society's strength wasn't measured by how well it preserved traditional roles, but by how effectively it unleashed the productive potential of all its citizens. That lesson had been written in the rubble of German cities, in the testimony of returned prisoners of war, in the slow, painful reconstruction of a shattered nation. It was a lesson paid for in millions of lives and decades of suffering. But it was true, and truth, eventually, was what mattered. This story isn't really about one German prisoner or one American farm family. It's about the collision of two fundamentally different social philosophies and the industrial consequences of that collision. Nazi Germany built its entire ideology around rigid hierarchies, traditional gender roles, and the belief that social order required keeping people in their proper places. The United States, whatever its other flaws, had no such ideological commitment to maintaining traditional structures. When war demanded total mobilization, America deployed women across its industrial base without serious ideological resistance. The result was production capacity that exceeded Axis capabilities by ratios that made Allied victory inevitable. Klaus Richter learned this lesson by living it, by watching Katherine Mueller repair tractors and reading about women building bombers, by going the mathematics that showed Germany couldn't win. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners learned similar lessons, though not all drew the same conclusions. But the evidence was undeniable for those willing to see it. Social freedom produced economic power, and economic power won modern industrial wars. The nation that gave women opportunities outproduced the nation that confined them to traditional roles. The nation that valued capability over ideology defeated the nation that chose ideology over capability. This pattern would repeat throughout the 20th century, as rigid authoritarian systems repeatedly failed to match the productive capacity of more flexible democratic systems. The lesson was written in Germany's defeat and has been confirmed by history ever since. If you want to understand how wars are really won, not just through tactics and technology, but through social organization and industrial mobilization, then this channel is for you. I spend months analyzing primary sources, prisoner testimonies, and production records to uncover the untold stories that shaped history. These aren't just military histories. They're revelations about how societies work, how ideology shapes outcomes, how the decisions nations make about their social structures have consequences that extend far beyond domestic policy. Hit that like button if this story challenged something you thought you knew about World War II. Subscribe to the channel because there are dozens more stories like this one. Stories about the collision between ideology and reality, about the unexpected sources of national power, about the human experiences that reveal historical truth, and turn on notifications so you never miss when I post new content. The history they didn't teach you in school is waiting to be discovered. Let's uncover it together.